So far, our investigation of music during the Middle Ages has centered on religious music, music of the Roman Catholic Church, then the only Christian religion in the European West. But there was also secular music, non-religious music, and for that there was popular secular music. Well, what was this pop music like? We really have no idea, or at least little idea. Why? Because the people who created the pop music were illiterate, couldn't read or write. In the Middle Ages, almost everyone was illiterate. The only people who were literate, who could write things down, well, they were the clergy, and they tended to write down religious music. So pop musicians made, but had no capacity to record their music, and thus almost all of it has disappeared. But some secular, non-religious music does survive from the aristocratic courts. This music was created by the troubadours and trouvères, and sometimes by the same priests who were composing sacred music for the church, but also appearing at court from time to time, and in that context wrote down secular music. Pachelbel, for example, worked at the court of several kings around Europe, the King of Bohemia, the King of Navarre, and the King of France in the course of his long career. So let's look now at the secular song and dance centered at the courts. And to do this, we have to call on a true expert, our guest for the day. So welcome again to another segment of Introduction to Classical Music. I'm delighted to have with us today my good friend and colleague here at Yale, Grant Herreid. Grant not only teaches music at Yale, he is a world-renowned professional early music performance specialist. And indeed, Grant just got off an airplane a day or so ago. Where were you? Austria or something like that?
I was in Austria, in Melk, and in another little town, in a little mini tour.
So he works out of New Haven. He also works, as many professional musicians do these days, out of New York City and travels around the world, playing in a professional group called Pifero and one or two others that we don't have time to go into today. But what we're going to do is take you through some of these instruments that were the primary media of performance in the Middle Ages, and we're going to look at some slides here, and Grant and I are going to comment on those slides, and you will be seeing those slides too. I showed this to Grant a couple of moments ago. This is entirely unscripted and unrehearsed, and he recognized it immediately. So what is this?
It's from a large work in Siena called The Effects of Good Government from the 14th century, right?
Yeah. I remember, I actually took this photo. I remember being way up kind of high on a wall. It occupies an entire wall of that. And in terms of looking at this, what do you see by way of performance activity here?
It's one of two examples in iconography at least, of ladies dancing. And you can see here the dancers doing some sort of a circle dance, which would have been called a carol or carol. And to the accompaniment of one of the ladies playing a drum, and since her mouth is open, it's possible that she's also singing,
right,
so a dance song.
Yeah, so the whole idea of singing and our English word carol is probably related to this in one way or another. Let's look at another one. This particular image comes from France, that much I know for sure, 14th century in the Bibliothèque Nationale, in the collection Fonds Français there. And we have a group of figures to the right, and then another dance there. But once again, most likely this was being sung. The text, Dame à vous son
rétolier.
Oh, you can read that. Well, you're a better man than I.
By Guillaume de Machaut. And in fact, this is from his Remède de Fortune, at a moment where the poet, Machaut himself, encounters his lady, much younger than himself, dancing with her friends. And it says clearly in the text that they're dancing without musical instruments.
Oh, really?
And they're providing all the music themselves just with their voices. And I think at one point she raises her little finger and beckons him to join the group. and it's his turn to sing, and so he sings this song.
Yeah,
while they
fascinating,
dance.
fascinating. Well, let's look at, now you mentioned that this one would have been danced to simply song, but people sing and dance obviously today. Let's look at another image here. And on the right side of the screen, we actually have one of these dance manuscripts. This again from the collection at the Bibliothèque Nationale. And then on the left, more importantly, we have, if we had the full image here, we would have dancers and the instrument that is accompanying here. So tell us, Grant, about this particular instrument, please.
This is known as the vielle, and it is the sort of workhorse of the medieval minstrel, we feel. Probably one of the main instruments to accompany both troubadour singing, to accompany the trouvère poetry in parts, and also probably to provide dance music.
Yeah, so it might be going a bit too far, but in an odd sort of way, almost etymologically, or at least organographically, it's related to the guitar in some odd kinds of ways, distantly, and we'll get into that as we go through some of the vielles in the 15th and 16th century. But it was almost a factotum. You could do a lot of things with this particular instrument. Let's look at some other slides. I'm going to ask Grant to comment on this one in particular, because here we have a different kind of position for the instrument, the vielle.
It's often hard to tell how large an instrument is from iconography. Often the painters seem to take liberties with the dimensions of things. But we know from practical experience that a smaller vielle you can play up on your arm, like we play the violin. Larger ones you'd have to play down more like a cello or something, and so that seems to be what this fellow is doing with this crossed leg there.
Yeah. So again, this instrument is called the vielle, spelled V-I-E-L-L-E, vielle. And here is another representation from Italy around 1400. Maybe not too much we can say about that. Any comments that you want to add there, Grant?
This one is one that seems to have a bourdon string, a string that's off the fingerboard. So just a plain drone that gives us a clue as to the sort of droney types of accompaniment that these early fiddle players may have used.
And I think this may be the last one of these that we're going to take a look at. It's a lot later. It comes from the time of Raphael in Rome in the early 16th century, but it's a particularly beautiful example of a vielle. And what do you see here? What strikes you about this?
This was a depiction of Apollo playing the lyre, and in the early Renaissance, the lira da braccio, the lyre that you played on your arm like that, was the main representation of Apollo's lyre. And you can see that it has 7 pegs, and therefore 7 strings, and that's also an imitation of the ancient lyre of Apollo, which was supposed to have 7 strings as well. Yeah.
Okay, well those are some images of the principal stringed instrument of the Middle Ages, the vielle. We're now going to go back and take a look at some other dance representations, but before we do that, we want to actually hear the sound of the vielle, and I think Grant's going to be able to demonstrate this on his own instrument.
This is a copy of the that looks very much like one of the depictions that we just showed. And the main way that they played it seems to have been up on the arm like this. But as the other fellow had it on his leg, you could also play it in this style.
So that's the way it sounded in the Middle Ages, although this is a reproduction, right? This does not come from the 14th century.
No, there are no vielles from that. I think the earliest one that anyone plays is actually played by Jordi Savall, and it comes from the early 16th century.
I see, yeah, the Spanish early music specialist. Well, let's go on. We're going to look at some more slides now, and you're going to join us. Here is one from England, as you can see, and we want to focus now. We do see here accompanying instruments, clearly a bagpipe and some shawms here. And then our next slide. Thoughts about this, Grant?
The common sort of dance band of the late 14th, early 15th century, or throughout the 15th century, in fact, was the alta capella, or the loud band, comprised of shawms, the early sort of oboe-type instruments, oboe and English horn, and often a brass instrument, either a slide trumpet or a early trombone, which was called sackbut in England and France.
So, and we're going to get to a representation of that a little bit later on. Let's look at a manuscript. There's not too much that we have to say about. We're going back to that same manuscript of some of this medieval dance music. This dates from the 14th century, and one can transcribe this material. If we look carefully, we could actually point out little stems going up and down, and they're the precursors of the stems and flags that we have on notational symbols today, what we call notes today. And then we can take this early manuscript here, and as my friend Tim McGee, who teaches at the University of Toronto, has done, edited in modern notation. So over to the left you see a facsimile of the original notation, and I could take you through that with regard to semi-breves and breves and that kind of thing, but we end up with quarter notes and eighth notes and half notes. So now we're going to hear the instrument that was foregrounded there, this double reed instrument called the shawm, S-H-E-W-M, shawm. So Grant, what do we have here? What's this thing?
This is the what we call the alto size. This is, again, a modern reproduction. We don't really know what kind of reeds they played on, since none of the reeds survive, but whole collections of different sizes of shawms do survive from the early Renaissance, and this is modeled on one of those. It's also called the bombard because it resembled a type of early cannon.
It sounds like one too. But so you're going to play it?
This is a bit of that.
Okay, so if all goes well, we're going to have a phrase or so of the dance, the estampie, the stomp, if you will, from the Middle Ages played on a shawm. Great. So that's a little taste of music from the Middle Ages, specifically instrumental music, specifically dance music, played on and demonstrated by Grant Herreid here on the vielle and on the shawm. And we're going to pick this up next time when we come to a session on music and the Renaissance. Thanks very much.